thank you for the invitation to be part of this symposium. It's a real pleasure, especially seeing that there are lots of familiar names and colleagues and friends on the webinar. So it's a real pleasure. So as you've mentioned, Jane, I'm going to present about using different types of evidence to inform guideline development. I'm really glad that I'm coming after James because he did such a nice presentation about complex interventions and specifically about face masks that I might be using in my examples. So I have no financial interest. I might be citing some of the work I've contributed to. And most importantly, the reflections I'm going to share today are based on a collective experience with other guideline methodologists, working with a number of different organizations like the World Health Organizations and others that has helped us learn a lot recently during the pandemic. So when going from the question, for example, that James mentioned, should we use face masks or not, to the recommendation, there are different components that come into play. There are different working groups, there are processes we need to use, tools, but most importantly maybe is the information that goes through these processes and these working groups use. So my presentation is really about this information. So I will be presenting the guideline development perspective, but also reflecting on the evidence synthesis perspective, what the implications are, and hopefully we could have some discussion about that. And I'm going to use some COVID-19 related examples. I'm afraid that people are getting into the COVID-19 fatigue. I'm just wondering whether people already feel the fatigue. If you could just give us a show of hand or use some of the reactions in Zoom just to share your feeling about the COVID-19 fatigue. But otherwise, I'm going to talk first about the types of information that are needed for guideline development, then talk about the types of evidence, and then talk briefly about processes and tools. So starting with the type of information needed, as it has been mentioned, for example, when I think about the face mask, you need to know what are the health effects, what are the desirable effects and undesirable effects, but also there are non-health effects that we need to know about. I'm talking from a guideline perspective, and then the contextual information, and I'll get to those. So starting with the health effects, obviously there are the desirable effects and the undesirable effect of any intervention. But also the other things we need to keep in mind that are important for guideline development and that are needed as we develop systematic reviews for guideline development are first the certainty of the evidence, rating, for example, using the grade approach, or the confidence in qualitative evidence using the circle approach. So this is an integral part of the information that a systematic review team would need to deliver. But also an important aspect is effect quantification. James already touched upon the questions about why does it work, under which circumstances, for which specific population, or what specific aspects of a complex intervention might be contributing to the benefit. So the effect modification is really important aspect of conducting the systematic review, specifically for guideline development purposes. So now thinking about the non-health effects, so this has become very obvious with the COVID-19 pandemic. Before the pandemic, people used to focus on a health theme and then gather information about the health effects. So the question I have for you, what kind of non-health effects information can you think of in relation to the examples I've used so far? So whether it's the example of the use of the face mask, or the example of lockdown or quarantine. Can you think about non-health effects? And if you could please share those in the chat box, that would be great. So, things that you might have done studies on or systematic reviews or even reflected on about in terms of non-health effects relevant to these health questions. Okay, so I see, thanks, Holger. Environmental impact of masks, definitely. That's important, and we're seeing this as a growing problem. Maggie is saying impact of education and learning. That's a perfect example we've been struggling with. Yes, Elena, economic impact. We've seen how the economy worldwide has been affected by this. And I see also other examples of socioeconomic impacts and loss of employment from Zuleika. Thank you. And definitely, and when you think about a guideline panel, thinking about, or a decision maker. So think about decision makers, which could sometimes be guideline panelists sitting in a room and trying to decide whether we should reinstitute lockdown. Obviously, they are doing this for public health purposes, but they need to think about these effects. Definitely, yes, equity, and yes, impact on people with hearing impairment. So these are wonderful examples. I think I've captured some of them, but maybe not all of them. The economic, education, sometimes crime-related, what happens with during the lockdowns and violence, etc. So again, in some cases, guideline panels might be in a position to say, look, we need to do that decision, but we also need to, beyond health effects, we need to know more about the non-health effects. And then James mentioned the issue of the contextual information. So in relation to the health effects and the interventions specifically, you need to think about the context. So I'll give some examples that you will see are from the beginning of the pandemic related to the face mask. So these were some of the items in the news. So Dr. Slam face mask price hikes, which is referring to an issue of the resource use and how initially that there was a resource issue, whether it's in the price or even the availability of face masks. If you think about N95 or some sophisticated face mask, this is too much of a sophisticated face mask that actually reflects the issue of acceptability. It might be much more effective than other masks, but is it acceptable? And then there's the issue of feasibility. Here, there was an issue of the global supply chain and the shortages, issues related to feasibility. So these are not health effects, but this is what we call in the context of guideline development, the contextual information. So values and preferences, resource use, someone just mentioned equity, Elie, I think, acceptability, feasibility, sometimes sustainability of the intervention. So this is what the guideline developer is looking for, thinking about the panelists. So from the perspective of the evidence synthesis team, we are, as systematic reviews, we are being asked to collect this information in addition to the health effects. And considering that many times we end up for those kind of public health questions not using any study design filter, we just capture all of the studies with any study design. This is a unique opportunity to capture those studies. So you will see that many organizations now, as part of the negotiation with the systematic review team, that will say, this is our PICO question. We need the effect on those outcomes, but we also need you to capture this kind of information. And this has become kind of standard with many organizations. I mentioned the WHO. This has become kind of standard with many of the groups working on such guidelines. So this is the type of information that is needed. I'm going to jump now to the types of evidence. You will see that maybe there's some overlap in the terminology. But what I'll mention under types of evidence is the use of primary versus secondary information when working on guidelines. I'll explain this further, and two other points about the types of evidence. So let's start first with primary versus secondary source of evidence. So when thinking about those contextual factors I mentioned a bit earlier, let's say acceptability and feasibility, and this is specifically what I'm referring now, the main source is the view of the panelists. So you have a systematic review team that has developed a systematic review about the health effects. And then for the contextual factors, the views of the panelists become the default option because there's no other source. Obviously, this is minimal time or resources that is needed. The problem with relying just on the panelists for those non-contextual factors is that they might not represent all key stakeholders, and they might not actually represent the valid view of those stakeholders. So the one alternative people have worked on is actually doing a systematic review of contextual factors, as I mentioned a bit earlier. This is obviously better because you build on published evidence, you could capture views of different stakeholders, and you could use different study designs, quantitative, qualitative, or mixed. In terms of disadvantages, the relevant evidence may simply not exist. So I might be interested in a certain topic about, let's say, healthcare workers, but then there's no studies published about acceptability of healthcare workers for a specific kind of intervention. You know, at the beginning of the epidemic, maybe the use of specific types of face masks. The existing evidence might not be relevant or might not be of high quality. And then there's the time and the resource issue, which is an important issue, as you have sometimes very strict timelines for the guideline process. So as systematic reviewer, you might be asked to develop those systematic reviews along the reviews of health effects. So what is the other alternative for the guideline developer? The other alternative is for the guideline developer to do their own primary study, for example, a survey of stakeholders about their acceptability and feasibility. The one advantage of a primary study is that the questions that are included in those surveys are tailored to the peak of question of interest to that guideline, which is really important. If you have 5 questions, you can have questions tailored to these 5 questions. As opposed to when doing a systematic review, what you find might be answering 1 PICO or 2, or might not be answering exactly the PICO of interest. This is an opportunity to produce high quality evidence if you design your study well. It's an opportunity to engage stakeholders. So you send the survey to your stakeholders, you engage them, you make them feel that they have stakes in that process, they have ownership in that process. And then you could use different study designs, as mentioned earlier. The disadvantage is the reliance on one study, which is that primary study. It's not peer-reviewed, and time and resources might be a bit more convenient than a systematic review, but could still take time if you think about ethics, approval, etc. So from your perspective as a systematic reviewer, as you are negotiating with the guideline group about what work you could do for them for the contextual factors, you need to think not only about the resources and the time, etc., but also what would be better. Because in some cases, you might simply say to them, look, based on a quick scoping review, we don't think that a systematic review would be the way to go, simply because there are no studies about this in the literature. So it might be better to go with a primary study, or vice versa. And we've been in both situations. So in this example, this was a primary study that was conducted for the specific question about healthcare workers in rural and remote areas, specifically because we knew from a quick scoping of the literature that there was no relevant studies for the contextual factors we were interested in for the specific questions we were trying to address. Versus in this situation, we knew from the panelists and the expert that there's tons of evidence about the specific topic of injection safety devices in healthcare settings. So we wanted to take advantage of that literature and build on it, as opposed to relying on our own primary study. So that was the question of primary versus secondary source of evidence. The next point about the types of evidence to reflect on as you are discussing or negotiating with the guideline panel is what kind of evidence do they use? How do they define direct, indirect, and relevant evidence? So to give you a representation, so let's think that there's a question about vaccine for the elderly, again, COVID-19. So the question is, there are different age groups that have been or might have been included in those studies. So studies of what age group would you consider as direct evidence that is definitely going to be included? What would you include as indirect evidence, meaning that if you end up identifying no direct evidence, what indirect evidence you would be able to use, and what would be irrelevant evidence? So let me ask you, and I think So first, thank you. You've done a wonderful job with the first question. So let's see how we do with the second question. So for this question, focus on the elderly population. What age groups would respectively provide irrelevant, indirect, and direct evidence? So let's start with direct evidence. So studies of which group would provide direct evidence? And maybe that's the easier one. Yes, if you could answer in the chat, that would be perfect. Yes, elderly. Okay, so maybe thank you. Thanks, Julie and Alison and Ella. Yes, so yes, you could define, yes, you have to define them. You have to define what elderly is actually, whether it's more than 65 or 70, definitely. Yes, thanks, Tracy. Okay, so now let's move to the indirect evidence. So let's assume as a guideline development group, you don't find any, or you have available to you any direct evidence of those groups that you have mentioned. What would you still consider as indirect but relevant evidence that you could still use in your guideline? What would be indirect evidence? Which age group? Okay, so we have carers of any age, 50 to 65, 50 plus, okay. Depends on the vaccine. So Tracy, thank you. So this is an important question because this division might depend actually on the specific questions. Ella is saying adults. Thank you. Any human who can make their own decision. Okay. And Julie is saying 18 plus. Okay. Now, what would be irrelevant evidence? So this is evidence that you could collect. And it's not direct evidence, but you wouldn't even count it as indirect evidence. So it's clear that it's direct, but you would even go further and say, I'm not going to even use that evidence. Okay, infants, great. Children, yes. Okay, I guess animal research. Thanks, Jama. So that's kind of a different types of research. Yes, Rita. So in terms of the question, this is what I reflected on. I thought for the question of interest, as most of you said, direct evidence is simply elderly. I would still use non-elderly adults or data from non-elderly adults as indirect evidence. But however, non-adults, meaning children, as most of you said, I would consider it as irrelevant. So what's the implication from a systematic review perspective? So from a systematic review perspective, there's a chance, so you will define the eligibility criteria along with the guideline development group. You say, this is the direct evidence we need, elderly, however you define them, above 65, 60, 75, etc. But there's a chance you go on and do the systematic review and come back and say, we identified no evidence. Then the guideline development group would say, okay, let's look for the indirect evidence. Which is the non-elderly adults in this example. Maybe a better way of doing this is at the beginning, as you start to set up your systematic review, is to agree with that guideline development group about those three categories. And in this case, it was simply cutoffs of age. What are the cutoffs of age for irrelevant evidence, indirect evidence, and direct evidence? And this way, when you go, what you would ideally do is simply exclude irrelevant evidence, definitely include direct evidence, and maybe just identify indirect evidence for now, just identify them, label them, put them aside in case there's this issue of, okay, we have no direct evidence, give us the indirect evidence. That would include or introduce some efficiency. And again, that would require some interaction and back and forth with the guideline development group. So same issue with randomized versus other types of evidence. Just being conscious of time, I had a question, but I'll skip the question to simply say the story with randomized versus other types of evidence, let's say non-randomized evidence, is a bit similar to the indirect evidence. In some cases, the panel might say, I would like to prioritize randomized studies. And this is what we should include. You go off do your search, you identify none, then they say, you know what, I would still be interested in non-randomized studies. So instead of doing this in 2 steps as systematic reviewers, it would be good from the beginning to have this understanding whether the panel would be interested in non-randomized evidence. So this way, the way you conduct your search and identify and label your study would prioritize randomized studies, but would at least label the non-randomized studies for the purpose of the guideline. So let me end with a few slides about processes and tools that could be used. So we're using now the concept of checkpoints for interaction between guideline groups and systematic review teams. So this starts with developing the recommendation question. So you would have a panel meeting discussing the question, and then you would have the systematic review team attending there as observers, and potentially to ask questions, because they would understand the nuances that the panelists are considering when defining their PICO question. A second checkpoint is to determine the information needed to develop the recommendation. And these are the issues I just went over a little bit. What is direct? What is indirect? What is irrelevant? Are you interested in randomized, non-randomized studies, etc.? Developing the protocol, and then presenting the interim findings. Presenting the interim findings is important in terms of interaction, because those of you who have interacted with as systematic reviews with guideline panels, one common potential conflict is at the time of the panel meeting, panels saying, you know what, you should not have included this study. Why did you miss that study? So this interim finding and sharing with them list of included studies, list of excluded studies will give you the chance to clarify with them what's in, what's out, and avoid last minute questions or questioning of the quality of your work. And then the obvious checkpoint is the presentation of the final findings at the time of the panel meeting. Again, from a systematic review team perspective, it would be important for you, if the organization doesn't have those checkpoints, to somehow develop those checkpoints to make sure that you deliver the work in a way that is not being questioned at some point, and that is as smooth as possible. So I'll focus just a little bit on determining the information that is needed to develop the recommendation. So we are in the process of developing what's called the peak ordering tool, which is kind of ordering the PICO, which is work that is being done between the guideline group and the systematic review group. So the first key question is to frame the public health intervention. So the public health intervention goes a little bit beyond the traditional PICO. So there's obviously the P for the population, intervention comparator, and the outcomes that need to be defined. But there is the setting. And James mentioned the context and the setting that need to be defined. I will talk about inpatient, outpatient. Sometimes this could be defined as part of the population, but sometimes it's good to disentangle those to represent the context in a clear way. You might also want to define the background interventions separately than the comparator. So typically in some PICO question, you would say the intervention is X and the comparator is standard of care. And then the question starts, the question that comes up is, what about the standard of care? Is it also used in the intervention group or not? So to avoid any confusion, just pull out the standard of care, put it in the background interventions. So these are interventions that are happening irrespectively. That's the standard of care that happens irrespectively. And then intervention comparator is looking at really what are the differences between the intervention and the comparator. And the comparator could be simply the absence of the intervention or another active intervention. And as you see at the bottom, in addition to the time frame, there's the potential effect modifiers. An important issue, as we've discussed, particularly with complex interventions, but with any kind of intervention or any question, to better understand when does the intervention work, for what specific population, what specific aspect, etc. And then as part of the peak ordering tool, you might say, okay, first for the desirable and the undesirable effects, I would like to have you'll see the PICO question on the left-hand side. So this is specifying the PICO elements, your basic eligibility criteria. Under type of studies, there would be an agreement. Okay, what would you want to have? Randomized trials only, or randomized and non-randomized studies? For diagnostic question, there might be accuracy studies, etc. Do you need observational studies of prognosis for baseline risk? And then the collection of evidence should ideally be a systematic review or other. And then under notes, there's the issue of whether you would want to prioritize or have both observations data, but also the indirect RCT data. And this is where you define the cutoffs we discussed. In another part of that table, which is acceptability, and I should have mentioned that this is based on what's called the evidence to decision table that was produced by the GRADE working group and reflects all the factors I mentioned earlier. If you get to the concept of acceptability, this is your question over here, and then you say there needs to be this reflection. Do I want a systematic, this is the collection of the evidence, a systematic review, a primary study specifically conducted for the guideline, or simply the expert input? This is the table I presented earlier. And then if you're doing your primary data collection, is it a study, a survey, quantitative kind of study, or a qualitative kind of study? So to conclude, there's no doubt that the evidence synthesis community and the guideline development community have been able to build synergies over the years, but also particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic and the related guidelines. There's a need to build on those and enhance the collaboration with other communities, example, the trial communities for the public health good. And I can say from our recent experiences that as much as collaboration has developed between evidence synthesis and guideline development, the trial community remains, unfortunately, to a large extent, disconnected from these other communities, or let's say not as connected as needed with these other communities. And I stole this line from James about the importance of methodological development moving forward. So thank you for the attention, and I'll stop here.
Elie, thank you so much for taking us further down to the evidence to decision pipeline. Sarah, what's come up in the chat?
Thanks, Jane. Again, we have a couple of comments about how interesting the example was, the example of the different age groups. Tracy has commented that we are in the UN Decade of Healthy Aging, which is taking a life course approach, and added a link there. Anyone would like to look? And Lisa has also commented that on the surface, this is quite a simple question, but different regulatory agencies and NGOs use different age cutoffs for child, adolescent, and so on. So the ones which are most policy relevant for the agency will likely be selected. And we also have a question, again from Andrew Booth. Isn't it a lot easier to judge the relevance of populations or interventions than it is for mechanisms? So what's conceptually relevant, such as attitudes to seatbelts versus attitudes to face masks?
Did you want to address that question, Elie?
Yes, thank you for all the questions. So maybe if Andrew, you could clarify when you give this example, you're saying that the attitude issue is more complex or more challenging to assess in terms of measurement?
Could we put Andrew's microphone on? Andrew, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly. Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks. Yeah, I was only just trying to make a bridge from the interesting work that Elie's just presented on complex interventions and some of our own thinking within the Cochrane qualitative group, where if we have reason to believe that people will behave or respond in similar ways, then that may make interventions more similar than they are if we simply catalogue their ingredients. So in other words, the similarity comes in how people may react or respond to something rather than simply what makes it up.
Yes, thanks for the clarification. And I think this is a good example about the need of these different streams of evidence to feed into the guideline development process. So it's not just health effects, it's not just contextual factors, it's not just quantitative studies, but also these, trying to explore how people react to these different interventions.